Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Racha Helwa. I'm the director of the empowerME initiative at the Atlantic Council, and I have the pleasure and honor to be joined today by Perihan Rifai, a former advisor to the IMF Executive Director Office for Arab countries and the Maldives. And I'm also very pleased to welcome my colleague, Josh Lipsky, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center. Welcome, Perihan and Josh.
Thank you, Racha.
So very excited today to host this discussion with Perihan as we just launched our report on the economic and social costs of the war in Gaza. Congratulations, Perihan, on authoring this important piece. For those who are watching, you can find the report now at www.atlanticcouncil.org/Mideast. So let me maybe begin with the first question. So it's been almost like a year since the start of the war, which actually erupted in the wake of the pandemic crisis, the Ukraine-Russia war, and the resulting energy crisis. What have been the implications so far on the economies of the region?
Hello, Racha. Hello, Josh. Happy to be here with you, and thank you for this very insightful question. Maybe to start off, the war has actually impacted the region's economies through various intensities. But the one overarching commonality that one has found is it has actually increased the level of uncertainty throughout the region. Other than that, we found that there have been adverse growth impacts, again, to varying degrees, because the way the report is structured, we focus on epicenter countries or epicenter states that are directly involved in the war, meaning Israel and the Palestinian territories. We also focus on the neighboring countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. And we focus on fragile and conflict-affected countries like Yemen and Syria, although not much Syria, mostly Yemen. And also we've talked about the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and the Maghreb countries. So that all leads to the different variations of the impact on these countries. So there's the adverse growth impact, of course mostly felt by the epicenter states. And we also notice that there have been sectoral impacts too, to different degrees. There have been impacts on the agricultural sector, on the tourism sector, on the construction sector, on the labor markets. There have also been impacts on the current account. Vulnerabilities have emerged in the current accounts of the countries throughout the economies throughout the region, again to varying degrees, and in general in trade relationships, and so it has been quite different depending on how involved the country is in the conflict, but also the level of growth and development of the country to start with. Some already came with pre-existing structural challenges that, of course, were exacerbated with the war.
Thank you. I just want to echo what Racha says, and thank you so much for doing this report. I hope everyone reads it online. There's such fantastic data in it. Important to understand what's happening in the economy, in the region. There's charts in there that really just elucidate the situation in a way that I think has not been said before, so truly well done and thank you. I want to ask about the global economy, because when I think back to a year ago in Marrakesh, the attacks happened on the eve of the IMF annual meeting, the attacks of October 7th. And at that time, even in the days after, the IMF said, we have to wait to see and assess the impact on the global economy. We're a year later now, and I wonder from your research, what you've seen, what are the impacts from the attacks and the war on the global economy, if there are?
The thing that has mostly really come to the fore in terms of impacts and to that adverse impacts is the impact on maritime trade. And that's because starting January of 2024, there have been attacks in the Red Sea by Houthi-led factions, and that has actually worked to increase security concerns for vessels that are traveling through the Red Sea, up the Suez Canal, and from that to Europe and the US. So maritime trade has been greatly impacted. To cite, for instance, Suez Canal, around 30% less vessels are actually traveling through the Suez Canal than they were pre the attacks, the Red Sea attacks.
Which is almost like 40 to 50% loss in revenue year to year?
Oh, absolutely. For Egypt, absolutely. The most recent reports find that around 50% of Suez Canal revenues have been lost in the first quarter of 2024. Wow. And that, of course, has its own foreign exchange impacts, fiscal impacts, etc. But again, it also has impacts on supply chains and just the delays that have been happening as a result of these attacks. In addition to the delays, there are also climatic impacts because smaller and less fuel-efficient vessels are being used to travel from around the Cape of Good Hope. They take longer, they're driven faster, and as a result, their emissions are higher. So there are those also climatic impacts that we also see as a result. So mostly it has impacted, it has caused delays in supply chains, but at the same time, it hasn't really driven up the costs as we would expect, simply because as of COVID, there had been an overcapacity in vessels, and so the increased cost in this diversion from the Suez Canal to around the Cape of Good Hope was not really translated much into prices for the consumer. However, should this continue, and if the delay, if these attacks continue, and eventually we might find, the prices, the increasing cost seeping through into consumer prices as well. But mainly it was as a result of that it impacted global supply chains and trade.
Thank you.
Let me take you back to the region, and I think you mentioned 3 layers of impact. So we're looking at the countries at the epicenter of the conflict. I'm mostly thinking of Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, beside Israel, Palestine, of course. And then we have another layer of the Maghreb countries. So those are probably affected somewhat, but not directly. And then we have the GCC, where I expect the most important impact would come through the oil volatility. So could you take us through these a little bit and show us the difference of impact between the 3 layers?
Sure. With respect to the epicenter countries or the states that are directly involved in the conflict, I'll start with Palestine or the Palestinian territories. We've had of course the loss of life and loss of lives, and as well as injuries, and just the cessation of economic activity in general in Gaza, in addition to the infrastructure demolishment in Gaza. And then when we move to Israel, and then of course with the Palestinian territories, this comes with its implications on the fiscal position, on the external position, on just the access to supplies,
services,
trade, all of that, and labor market too. Labor market impact, because a percentage of the Palestinians living in West Bank and in Gaza actually travel into Israel to work in Israel's construction sector. And so there's a loss of livelihood that comes through that channel. And so having said that, moving to Israel, we have the impacts on the construction sector, as I mentioned. We do have sectoral impacts, also the agricultural sector. because at the start of the war, there has been a massive or a significant military reserve mobilization, the second largest in Israel's history. And what that ended up doing was taking labor away from economic activity into the military. And that, of course, brought its own supply shock, labor supply shock to the Israeli market. And as a result, and the labor market in general in Israel has had its pre-existing challenges before even the October 7 conflict erupted. And so, having said that, also looking at Israel, there are fiscal impacts as well from increasing militarization. Israel had recovered very robustly from the COVID pandemic. Its economy was quite robust, built on the high-tech sector. Its debt to GDP, its public debt to GDP was on a downward trajectory. It had reversed its fiscal deficit to one of surplus. And so the onset of the war has actually worked to change all of that and reverse it, so to speak. And when we look at neighboring countries, Egypt has had its own pre-existing economic challenges that were exacerbated by the breakout of the conflict, most dramatically or most significantly shown in the reduction in tourism, which is a significant source of foreign exchange to Egypt, but also once the Red Sea attacks commenced, also a reduction in foreign exchange earnings to Egypt, which helped exacerbate its already challenging foreign exchange situation and its current account and balance of payment difficulties. So that was, in addition to the fiscal impacts also, because the Suez Canal revenues also feed into the fiscal revenue side of things. Lebanon, unfortunately, had gone into a financial crisis in 2019, and which led to a collapse pretty much in the banking sector, a significant retraction in economic activity, and they were increased in poverty, and they were already at a very difficult, challenging macroeconomic point before the October 7 conflict. And this just helped increase or exacerbate their challenges through reducing their tourism, but also due to the eruption of conflict along Lebanon's southern border, which now, of course, has become more intensified in general through the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. Jordan had been doing relatively better, simply because they were in an IMF arrangement. They had progressed quite positively on economic reforms. However, Jordan hosts a lot of refugees. Actually, so does Lebanon too. And the influx of refugees, in addition to the already high level of refugees that existed, worked to further challenge the Jordan's economy and, of course, Lebanon's economy. And when we look at the other countries in the region, specifically, we'll look at the conflict-affected countries. They already had been starting, from a very challenging socioeconomic conditions. For instance, Yemen was the worst humanitarian crisis even before the conflict broke out. And with the Houthi led attacks, and the sanctions that have been placed also, that has helped also exacerbate the socioeconomic conditions. The GCC countries were not really impacted. And surprisingly, despite what we thought at the beginning, that oil prices would shoot up at the onset of the conflict, that did not happen, mainly because of the stabilization of production of oil supply globally through OPEC+, but also because there were already high oil inventories in the US, which helped stabilize the market. However, having said that, and with the intensity that we may be witnessing, where if Iran is brought into the conflict as a regional actor, that may work to, place pressures on the oil market or the energy market in general. And then finally, the Maghreb countries, not much, not as intense, of course. Although with Algeria, tourism was impacted, so was
Tunisia?
Sorry, and so
Tunisia.
was, yes, exactly. But other than that, it's less of an impact as other countries that are directly involved or close to the conflict.
Proximities. Can I just follow up on the oil point? Because a year ago and 6 months ago, we were all talking about these potential price shocks. As you said, they haven't materialized, and you outlined the reasons why. But all of those reasons seems like something we could have diagnosed a year ago. U.S. supply, China's weakening demand is also, I think, a factor here.
Yes.
But you talked a little about what could change going forward if Iran's involved. How would that actually change the oil price dynamics if the conflict were to escalate and Iran were to become involved?
That's actually a very important question, Josh, because previously what had been happening was, even though the conflict is in the region and the region is a major oil supplier, however, the major producers or providers of oil were not directly impacted. And neither was the oil infrastructure targeted. Should these two conditions change, that might actually bring about a change in, increase the vulnerability of the energy market in general. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think, Perihan, you touched briefly on migration and displacement, which unfortunately is a major consequence of conflict. So in Jordan alone, there has been about 3 million refugees from Palestine before the war,
Yeah.
and 2 additional million, I think, came on board after the war. Some more, maybe, I read numbers like 400,000 in South Lebanon as well. In terms of humanitarian aspect and social assistance, how are these refugees going to be basically treated, catered in terms of healthcare, education, how to keep the region on track for overall economic and social development at large?
That's also another very important question that sometimes goes a little bit under the radar when the conflict comes up. Lebanon, I believe, hosts the second largest refugee population per capita. Jordan hosts the second largest share of refugees per its population. And Egypt has also has its own share of refugees or those externally displaced into Egypt. So the first impact would be on the pressure that refugees would have on the economy of the hosting country, especially if it's a country that already is facing challenges like Lebanon. Lebanon, since the financial crisis, is facing very dire socioeconomic challenges, and then of course their hosting of the refugees, they're an extra pressure point on public utilities, including, of course, the social sectors, health and education, but also in general on the economy. And so in the absence of the necessary funding through humanitarian means to help host these refugees in appropriate conditions, unfortunately what ends up happening is the refugees suffer in addition to the host country's citizens too. Poverty actually has been increasing amongst the refugee population, both in Lebanon and in Jordan. Jordan, for instance, has, the international community has really not stepped up its funding to help hosting countries. And there was a report that mentioned in November of 2023, Jordan only received 50% of what it needed to host its refugees. So there's really there's a large impetus for the international community to really help those hosting countries appropriately host those refugees.
Can I follow up? I want to dive more into Israel's economy. You talked about this a little bit, the relatively strong position they were in going into the war and the impacts mobilization included on the economy. This is now one of the longest, if not the longest, wars in Israel's history.
Yes.
What are the long-term implications here? Obviously it depends on the length of the conflict, but what do you see happening on different sectors? Tourism, technology, foreign investment?
So the medium to long, what's been happening is at the very beginning, projections were, or expectations were, that the conflict would be over by end 2023. However, as we see projections and as we see reports coming out from the Israeli authorities, you find that now the expectation is that the conflict is going to be prolonged. The most recent Bank of Israel report or forecast assessment assumes that the conflict will be over well into 2025. And that, of course, has growth impacts, economic activity impacts, also has fiscal impacts because the war budget is a lot higher than what it was pre-war. Debt, whereas it was on a downward trajectory before the war, is now not. And unless fiscal measures are taken into consideration through the revenue and the expenditure side, we might find that debt may not resume its downward trajectory. So in addition to that, you also have inflation is now, unlike the rest of the world where inflation has been reined in to a great extent. Unfortunately, inflation is creeping up in Israel as a result of supply side shocks, which are a result of the labor constraints, the labor market constraints, but also as a result of other shocks in the conflict areas where there's displacement also, and the Israeli population there had to move, and so economic activity was disrupted. So coming with creeping inflation, we would also have higher interest rates so that, for the authorities to try and rein in inflation. And of course, higher interest rates are not conducive to investment. And so you will have those adverse impacts on the Israeli economy if the conflict is prolonged or is intensified, actually, or both.
Especially at a moment globally where a lot of central banks are now cutting interest rates.
Exactly.
So the foreign investment
exactly
comes into play.
And one further thing is unfortunately, investor sentiment is also impacted, not just with regards towards Israel, but also towards the region. The longer the conflict, the more intense the conflict is, the more we will see investors turning away from the region to varying degrees for the different countries.
Thank you. Racha.
So looking ahead and thinking more about what happens after the war, I know the World Bank estimated the cost of reconstructing infrastructure in Gaza at around 19 billion, and that's only accounting for the damage up to the end of January 2024. Do we know who will bear the costs of reconstruction in Gaza?
Unfortunately, the lack of clarity around the politics of the reconstruction and the funding of the reconstruction is another challenge that plays into the conflict. There are several scenarios as to how, when ceasefire does happen, how the funding will take place, by whom. Currently, there are talks of possibly 3 of the Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, contributing to the reconstruction costs. There's also been mention of the EU. There's also been mention of Germany, since they are amongst the higher contributors, donors to the Palestinian territories, to Palestine. And there's also been some talk of possibly the US. However, depending on the bill, so to speak, and depending on whether or not development strategies are built into the funding framework, some governments may actually balk at providing funds to reconstruction, knowing that the conflict may flare up again. So it's still very uncertain, and this, unfortunately, also the lack of clarity weighs down on moving forward.
Thank you. So I think you touched briefly on the perception of foreign investors coming into the region under uncertainty, and the conflict having exacerbated other aspects of whether direct investment or indirect through financial markets. Do you think that this is going to be a complete turn down for investors long term, and is this also going to affect the Gulf, given that they're not, at the epicenter of the conflict?
So, in general, investors do not like political uncertainty, right? Or even political instability. And depending on how involved the different countries would be, and if we talk about the Gulf, that would reflect on how little or how more investor sentiment goes towards these countries. But in general, what has been talked about and what sort of makes sense is the longer the conflict goes on and or the more intense it becomes, the more likely investors could be turned away from the region, simply because they may prefer to put their funds or their investments in more safe, in safe haven economies or countries rather than invest in the region. Their uncertainty is still very high, simply because we don't really have we don't really have even a short-term view on what may happen. And again, uncertainty is not something that investors like, or that financial markets like as well, right? So it really depends at this point.
Can I ask one final question? I know we're almost out of time, but you undertook significant research for this project in the midst of an evolving situation. And I wonder, just process-wise, how you went about it, and then if anything surprised you in the research. Obviously, you're going to find the economic impacts, and you knew that going in, but is there something that came out while you were researching that you didn't expect?
I have to say that the most surprising turn of events for me was, as we discussed earlier, the dynamics of the energy markets, the price of oil. I think we all had in our minds, in the back of our minds, the 1973 oil shock, right? Or even periods of conflict in the region, and unfortunately they have been many, and how they have impacted the oil market. That was, to me, the positive turnout, the stability, so to speak, has been a surprise to me, a favorable surprise.
There's actually a reason for that, I think. So first, of course, controlling the supply side is one aspect, but also moving gradually away from fossil fuel and focusing more within the region, including in Saudi Arabia and in key oil exporter countries on green energy. So it's as if the region was sort of prepared for that in a way, and also having to go through the Ukraine-Russia energy crisis, sort of every, I think, country region has worked on their own energy security portfolio, so this helped as well.
And as you said, I think the US being a leading supplier of energy, in a way these previous shocks did not have that in the market.
Yeah. And what maybe changed, especially with regards to the US oil market, was that the cost of shale extraction had became a lot cheaper, and so really allowed for large extraction and a large supply.
Racha, any final words before we wrap up?
No, I'm super honored to have worked with you on this.
Thank
and
you.
Very, very happy with the quality of report. And as you mentioned, Josh, I think I've seen before maybe piecemeal sort of analysis of how the war has impacted some countries or maybe the epicenter countries, but I haven't seen like the full picture of how does this interrelate with regional dynamics, global dynamics. So well done on this. Congratulations.
Just to echo that. Thank you so much for doing this work. I hope everyone takes time to read it,
I hope
go
so
in depth
too.
and ask us questions and follow up.
Thank
and
you.
Racha, thank you for the partnership with empowerME on this project. We've been proud to partner on it. I want to thank everyone for joining us of day 2 at the IMF World Bank annual meetings at the Atlantic Council live from the IMF headquarters. Tomorrow morning at the Atlantic Council headquarters, we will host European Central Bank Christine Lagarde at 10 a.m. Please tune in for that, and you can find our full programming at atlanticcouncil.org. We wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.